Howdy folks, it is time for our next lecture. So we are going to continue in our story in industrialization and the economic politics and view of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So what we're doing today is sort of an add-on to our last class. I left you somewhat intentionally with the grand idea that this industrialization was awesome and we've got this massively developed country and the country looks different and it feels different and it's attracting all sorts of people and it's golden, right? But the reality is that it wasn't golden for everybody. Capitalist development on that scale, and this is a truth that you will see as we study the rest of American history too. Capitalist development on that scale does not happen without the existence of a massive lower class, because that is one of the facets of capitalism. That's one of the realities of capitalism, is class division. So we've talked about other dividing lines in American history, right? We talked about the North and the South. We talked about white and black. Now we're going to talk about the wealthy and the poor. You started this conversation when you read Andrew Carnegie. We've already been having some discussions about it, but we would be remiss if I was just like, yay, industrialization, and the United States got factories, and we got super wealthy. There were consequences to that, and those consequences have to do with the intricacies of capitalism. So this lecture really allows us to explore a little bit more about the nature of capitalism in American history, and that's one of the reasons why this is a super exciting era to examine. Okay, so things that you should be thinking about, that you should be knowing as we go along. Broad questions. Who benefits from capitalism? Who benefits how from capitalism? Is it something that the wealthy class benefits from only? Can poor people benefit from it? In what ways? And who's making these arguments and at what times? What are some of the weaknesses of capitalism? If we looked at the strengths of capitalism in the last class, innovation and focus on hard work and national superiority, right? If we looked at some of the strengths of capitalism, what are some of the weaknesses of capitalism? Who is made vulnerable by capitalism? Just as we discussed, who is made powerful? What were the alternate visions for economic life in America? Capitalism's dominance was never set. There were always folks who envisioned a different world, who thought that there could be equality, economic equality among all people, which is generally not something that Americans have focused on in larger political circles. So who envisioned what? What does economic equality look like? And how did people fight for it? And what were their arguments? And then if we're going to have an equal society, not just economically speaking, but like politically speaking, because I want you to start to understand the relationship between economics and politics in that way, what were some of the institutional regulations that were needed? What curbs should the federal government place on capitalism? Or should it not put any curbs? Generally speaking, that's one of the main divisions between the two political parties. Democrats tend to believe that there should be more, now, current, I'm talking current. These terms don't apply in the past, and you'll see why. Current Democrats tend to think that there should be more curbs placed on capitalism, and current Republicans tend to think that there will be less. But even the most conservative of Republicans in this modern moment generally believe that there should be some curbs placed on a capitalist economy. Hence why Donald Trump gave money to the American population during the COVID pandemic, because there's some realization that the federal government needs to regulate and protect and step in, right? Now, the degree to which people thought that is shaped by American history. And that's again, like one of the really cool and exciting facets of today's lecture. How should the federal government step in? How should they regulate the economy? Well, we're talking about a moment in American history when they just didn't regulate the American economy. What does that look like? That's what we talk about today. So we start with a big question. Let's say that you want to develop a capitalist economy in a new nation, and the United States is not new, but we're doing a thought experiment here. You want to develop a capitalist economy, and you want it to be very strong, and you want it to be thriving, and you want it to be multifaceted and have lots of different components. The question is, what do you need? Think about that. What does capitalism need in order to thrive? Pause me. Capitalism needs a lot of things. One of the things that I want to focus on in this class is that every single thing that capitalism as an economy needs is hotly contested. So we're going to go through each one of these things and talk about why it was controversial. But the reality of America was that it had all of these things, and it had these things in great numbers. And it was sort of, there wasn't any grand hand orchestrating whether or not these things were all in the same place. But America happened to have these things, and that's why capitalism became the predominant, overarching political and economic force. So think about it this way. If you want to create a capitalist economy, you need land, you need raw materials, and you need space. You need capital. You need money to start things in order that the economy can get kicked off. Remember last time we talked about this as a circular process, right? That circular process needs things fed into it at all the various parts along it. You need an ideology. You need some way to believe in the capitalist narrative, a rhetoric that says if you work hard, you will do well, a rhetoric that maintains the labor force. We're going to be talking about that one specifically. You need labor. You need actual people that do things, that are cogs in machines. Without that, nothing happens. And you need structure. You need the physical structure of the landscape. You need the economic structure. You need methods of incorporation and banking. You need a structure that allows these things to thrive. Every single one of those things was hard. I don't want to say hard won because that seems like it's justified. Every one of those things was full of controversy. Every one of those components of capitalism was full of discrepancy. Take, for instance, land, right? You need the raw materials for industry. You need to have access to iron and ore, and eventually you would need access to rubber and other sorts of textiles. So all of that was in conquering space, whether that space was on the continent, right, or whether it was through conquest abroad, which we will talk about in one of our following lectures. You need space for transportation. Things like warehouses and trains and routes, these things take up a lot of land. You have to have that land in order to make the routes go through it. You need space for people. Capitalism requires a lot of people to do the work, and you need space for them to live. And you need food. We know that one of the main reasons for expansion westward was simply to feed all of the people in growing urban centers. Sorry. But every single one of these things was contested because that land did not belong to the United States. That land belonged to Native Americans. And that expansion abroad would mean like incursion into Spanish lands and Cuban lands and more. So this desire for space is highly controversial. In other words, when we're talking about whether or not capitalism succeeds, like whether or not it wins totally and overall, think about the fact that every single one of the factors of it is absolutely necessary for capitalism, and also a thing that America sort of grabbed and took advantage of. You need capital. You need capital in order that you can buy land, in order that you can buy factories, in order that you can have laborers, in order that you can buy raw materials, right? You need capital in order to start. Capital could come from personal funds, it could come from corporate financing, and it could come from banks. But capital was contested too, because not everybody had access to capital. If you want to start a shoe factory, you need a significant amount of money in order to start it. You don't need as much money in order to start a small artisan's business, but that's not what industrialization looks like. This capital was distributed unevenly because only wealthy people have personal money, only well-connected people have access to becoming part of a corporation, and only people in the North have access to banks for credit. I talked briefly in the last class about the consequences of the National Banking Act of 1865. Hold me accountable to that. One of the consequences of that was that money was much more available in the North than it was in the South and in the West. So capital is necessary. but capital is unevenly distributed. You need structure. You need like the physical structure of the land, but you also need a corporate structure and a banking structure. And this changes the whole demography of American life. More capital means there are more corporate investors. For the first time, you get a class of people that can live without actually laboring. This is high management, right? You also get middle management, a class of people whose job is paperwork. This is white collar work, which comes out of the Industrial Revolution, right? Middle class people, the middle class had been super tiny before and had been mostly artisanal laborers. But now that middle class is larger because that middle class is functioning for corporations. That middle class is lawyers and bankers and tellers and a whole host of people that serve that new structure. And in this, you get a massive then break in classes. You get the very wealthy, then you get the white collar work, and these are small classes, and then you get the bulk of people that get put at the bottom of that. That is labor. In order to make any of this work, you need people. You need people that will do the jobs that keep it functioning, jobs that I will talk about in a second. But those jobs tend to be very low paying jobs. The entire reason that industrialization can kick off in the way that it does is because we have low paying jobs. It's because there are people willing to work those jobs. None of this would have happened in the United States. None of this birth of industry, none of the growth into the greatest powerhouse in the United States without that influx of people. And that came through immigration. So let's talk a little bit about a chart here, which I find interesting. So in the 1830s and the 1840s, the United States starts to see its first few waves of immigration. This I talk about in the first half of US history, if you've taken that course with me. This is a little bit of a different place in American history. Before then, there aren't a lot of numbers for it, frankly, because everybody to the Americas that was white was an immigrant, and the others that were immigrants were black, and they didn't have a choice. So the numbers before it aren't really maintained in the same way. Starting in the 1820s, people started to maintain those numbers. The 1830s and the 1840s saw immigrants mainly from Germany in the 1830s and the Irish in the 1840s. That's because of the potato famine. So we see a skyrocketing number in the 1850s. It goes down in the 1860s because people tend not to want to immigrate to somewhere where there's an ongoing civil war. However, after the Civil War is over, immigration picks up again minorly and then crazy spikes. This is because of a few things. It's because of the culminating process of industrialization and capitalism, and it's because of discontent and unrest in Europe, which we're not talking about too much in the course of this class. So we can see this spike here, and then it dips a little bit. This is largely because of the Panic of 1893, which we'll discuss in a bit. And then it skyrockets again, peaking in the 1910s, which, interesting enough, 1910 is when the first Falvos came over to America, and I have that paperwork. So if you consider yourself part of that broad body of white Americans that has a mixed national heritage, it's likely that your earlier family members came over in this period of time. Or if you were a more recent immigrant, there's a whole spike of immigration that happened in the last 10, 15 years. That's another story, and that doesn't happen in this part of the class. But the peak that we're talking about is this peak right here, right? And those numbers come from, as my family did, Italy. There's a large portion of Italian immigrants, but they also come from Ireland. They also come from Germany. They also come from Poland, and they also come from Scandinavia and Hungary and a whole host of places. Primarily, I would say Polish, Italian, and German, but lots of other things in there, right? That wave of immigration is, did I just read unintentionally? I did. Look at me, unintentionally reading the things that I put on the slide. That wave is what fueled this industrialization. Those folks came over to America because the economic circumstances in their home countries were untenable. And what they heard about America was partially true and partially false, that it's the land of opportunity. That you can get a job no matter who you are. That part's definitely true. That you can get an unskilled job in something you've never done before. That part is definitely true. And so they come over in large numbers. Now, Americans are not necessarily cool with this. So in this first wave, there's not a lot of pushback against these people. These are seen as fairly good immigrants, the German immigrants in particular. There's some pushback against Irish immigrants in the 1840s and in the 1850s. The Civil War changed that conversation, but there's a greater conversation after the Civil War about whether or not immigrants are good for an economy. I want to clarify that this pushback against immigrants was not they're taking our jobs. They took our jobs. If you ever watch South Park, I feel like this is a pretty essential thing to know. Anyway, I reference South Park a lot. But this fear of immigrants is less in this particular moment a fear of immigrants taking the jobs, as much as it is a fear of a changing economy. So you were, let's say, that shoe cobbler that had an artisanal shop, right? You're not mad that 10 Irish immigrants are going to come and take your job. You're mad that 10 Irish immigrants are going to make a factory possible that makes your job obsolete. So it's an important difference in that particular economic relationship. It's not that they're taking the very same jobs. It's that the transformations they are bringing on the American economy make those jobs obsolete. There's a couple of key populations that people do not like, and that's largely because of racism. So there is hatred against Irish people and there's hatred against Italian people. This is very true because the Italians and the Irish were not considered white, but there's a lot more hatred against Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants were very looked down on as a non-white race. Americans called this the yellow peril. They said that Chinese citizens are coming over to take over the United States. Primarily, that immigration went to the western coast, and Chinese immigrants did things like work in the railroads and work in fish factories, canning fish, and they established the West Coast. But people were very anxious about them. They said that they were all opium dealers. They said that they were prostitutes, that they came over and were public charges. So therefore, the first real immigration act of the 19th century actually banned Chinese immigrants. And the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 would be re-upped for another 10 years in 1892. But it banned all Chinese immigration to the United States, and it prohibited people of Chinese descent from obtaining citizenship. So you can start to see how beginning in the 1880s, you have a real hatred for external factors in the United States. Factors that, due to racism, white people thought were shifting the demography of the US. They were right. They just were right about the fact that that was a bad thing. Were wrong about the fact that that was a bad thing. And they were worried about the changes that those immigrants were creating. They weren't the only ones, though. The Immigration Act of 1882 made all immigrants subject to a poll tax, or an immigrant tax, and made some immigrants illegal if they were determined to be public charges. What is a public charge? A public charge is someone that you feel will not pull their economic weight. So women that were deemed to be prostitutes, children that had no parents, people that were sick or ailing or had physical disabilities were all turned back at the ports. So some seriously, questionably moral things to do in 1882. And then there was another law in 1885, the Alien Contract Labor Law. This is a little bit different and very interesting. It prohibited U.S. businesses from contracting with laborers abroad to bring them to the United States. So, like, for instance, let's say that I ran that shoe factory in, I don't know, Boston, and I'm short on laborers. So I go to Italy and I'm like, hey, I'm going to send my rep to Italy and he's going to promise 15 of you citizenship and guarantee that you'll get through the ports if you come and you promise to work in my shoe factory. Businesses didn't like that, mostly because it gave some businesses a competitive edge. So that one was less about the immigrants themselves as much as it was about a regulation of businesses. The problem was that as much as people disliked immigrants, immigrants were necessary for industrialization because only immigrants, only the most disadvantaged, only the most cash poor, only the least assimilated into the culture, would be willing to take the dangerous, dirty jobs that industrialization requires, right? I'm talking about shoe factories a lot. That's been my example today for some reason. But would you really be excited to take a job where your entire job was to go like this repeatedly to stamp out the pattern of a shoe on rubber? Or where your entire job was to sew 3,000 pairs of shoes a day, and if you didn't make that quota, you got fired. So we're talking about the jobs that white Americans generally do not want to take because they are dangerous, they are repetitive, and they are draining. So you might think, okay, well, shoemaking doesn't sound that bad, or meatpacking doesn't sound that bad, or steelworking doesn't sound too bad. But all of these had serious, serious threats. Shoemaking actually really involved very heavy machinery, particularly to roll out and stamp the rubber. If you worked in a textile mill, textile mills in particular, but sewing factories also, were very subject to fire. Let's put a lot of super flammable materials in a wooden building that is not ventilated, really close to one another. Awesome job. But not only that, but you'd be breathing in fibers all day. And so people who worked in textile mills were known to get tuberculosis and to die from tuberculosis pretty frequently because you'd be breathing in cloth fibers all day. These were more often women's jobs, these three, but a lot of these were men's jobs as well. Railroads were particularly dangerous. The effects of dynamite were not fully understood, but you needed to use a lot of it to get through a mountain. So immigrants were sent in to do that dangerous work, to be the ones that were in unstructurally sound kinds of work environments. That's particularly true of railroads. There were a lot of railroad accidents. Coal miners are another kind of unskilled labor, particularly one that affected Appalachia, so the Appalachia Reckoning that you may or may not have read for the common reader, that is what we're talking about here. Those immigrants that worked in the coal mines, they suffer black lung, which is when you breathe in so much coal dust that your lungs become coated in it. And they also suffer all sorts of other respiratory diseases and the dangers that working in a flammable underground environment presents. Meat packers, you read a significant amount about, so I'll talk about that in a second. Railroad porters, even, not just the railroad workers, but railroad porters also suffered accidents. These are the people that work the rail line in more official capacities, so drivers and kind of stewards and that sort of thing. But railroads were extraordinarily dangerous for workers and for passengers alike. I've got some stats on that. Between 1890 and 1917 alone, 72,000 employees were killed, 2 million were injured, and another 158,000 killed in the repair shops. So, railroads are not safe to ride or to work on at all. Steel workers too. You're talking about heavy metals here, right? These are really easy jobs to die in. And if you don't die, to lose an arm, right? Because we don't exactly have solid treatment for infections yet. So this is a really dangerous kind of labor. The meatpacking industry was one of the ones that got a lot of attention. So muckraking journalism is something I want you to know the term for. Muckrakers were journalists that tried to expose, much in the ways that I just did to you, why these things were dangerous. So why is it dangerous to work in a sewing factory? You might have this idyllic version or picture in your head of 100 women sitting in a line chatting, ha 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 ha, little stitch and bitch. No. That's not what this is like. Journalists tried to show what the realities of that work were. So I had you read for today only a very short excerpt from a really cool book called The Jungle. And The Jungle talks about what it was like to work in a meatpacking industry. And the book isn't actually focused on that. The overall part of the book is focused on this family of Lithuanian immigrants, and it very much so showcases the marriage and the children and the family and the importation of traditions and the way they get swindled by politicians and the way that they can't afford medical care. It shows a lot of different things. But the thing that stuck out to Americans the most was the description of Jurgis's job, the head of the household, his job. And he worked in a meat packing plant. And Sinclair went into the meat packing plants and he sort of explained what they were. Now, you will notice that I'm consistently focused on meat production because it fascinates me. But this was a really monumentally different thing for Americans than the way that meat had been processed before. Suddenly, you get meat that is slaughtered on a line, that is processed by one person at a time. So all that Jurgis did is he killed. That's what he did, right? He was on the killing floor. So you see that they talk about how you utilize every part of the pig. They talked about the kinds of labor. He talks about the environment, right? Pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics. And yet somehow the most matter-of-fact person could not help thinking of the hogs. So he shows how it was dangerous. I mean, you're working with like big metal cleavers and you are standing in pools of blood all day. And there are people that work on the pickling floors, and then there's the people that render the fat. And so it's dangerous. There's heavy machinery. There's a lot of chemicals. There's a lot of bacteria. There's a lot of sickness. And what's really interesting about this is that the entire book, the jungle, right? The entire book was meant to say, look at these immigrants and look at what they have to do and look at what they have to experience. But interestingly, what people heard was, look how dangerous the meat I'm eating is. So white middle-class reformers, Sinclair very famously said, I struck for their hearts, but I hit them in the stomach. In other words, he tried to get people to feel sympathy for Jurgis and his family, but really he made people like disgusted by meat. And the consequence of this was not regulations on laborers. It was actually the birth of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, in 1906. But what he was trying to point out, and what we will get back to, is the reality of how hard it would be to be a laborer in this. So let's say that you were perfectly comfortable being the person that for 14 hours a day, for 6 days a week, killed pigs. That was your job, right? You slit their throats. Okay, so let's pretend like you got that really good work, which would be considered really good work, in a meat packing plant. You might, at best, make $1.50 a day. That was considered a very high wage, right? In order to make the poverty line, which is $500 a year, you would need to work 334 days out of that year. You would also need to work the whole day. You would also need to work a significant number of days a week. We're not talking 2-day weekends. We're talking one at most. You would really not be capable of doing that because it's physically demanding work. And you have to be able-bodied in order to do it. Most people are not strapping young men that can do this all day. And part of the book that he really emphasizes is like, Jurgis was that, right? Like he was this strapping young man from Lithuania that was determined to make a living. And he gets sick and he can't do that anymore. People are faced in these jobs where they will lose a limb or they will be sick with tuberculosis, and there's no way to get that 334 days a year if you're able to find it because you're not actually able-bodied all of the time. 16% unemployment in American cities could be an average for the year. It could go almost as high as 25%, and that was considered fairly normal. 45% of workers thus hovered right around the poverty line, which they managed only by having every single member of their household work, men, women, and children. And there were no child labor laws until the very, very late 19th century, and children were very prized for their small size, particularly in the textile industries. So child labor, as well as full family labor and less than $1.50 a day labor, meant that 45 workers hovered around the poverty, 45%, but 40% lived below the poverty line. A full 25% of workers, of laborers, lived in absolute squalor. This would mean that they would literally eat food out of the trash, and they would get and sell trash in order to make a living. What we see with the development of an industrial economy is that this type of poverty is new. Like in other kinds of poverty in other places, you could generally get by making what you needed. But in a city, that's not possible. You can't grow chickens and let them roam around in a backyard. You can't have cows and pigs and have them graze until you can eat them. You can't grow the crops that you eat. For the first time, money is essential to survival, and you have people that aren't making that money. So you have this really interesting moment when poverty itself changes, and you have more in a poor working class than you had ever had before. So arguably, the last thing that you need in order to make capitalism work, that is the most controversial of all of those things, is an ideology. You need some way of believing that makes workers feel like getting out of those slums is possible. You need some way of understanding capitalism that says, sure, there are haves and have-nots, and that works. That's one of the things I wanted you to see from Carnegie, right? Like he sees there are wealthy people and there are poor people, and that is totally fine, and this is how the world works that way. And the ideology that arose out of that would become so central to America in the next, well, hundreds of years, was this idea of the bootstraps theory, right? This idea that you can pull yourself up out of poverty if you just work hard enough. That's the idea, but I want to remind you of those poverty lines and of the 25% unemployment and of the dangers inherent to these jobs. So the ideology doesn't necessarily correlate with reality. I mean, point blank, it does not correlate with reality, but it is nevertheless important because you have to believe that that's possible in order to keep capitalism functioning. And not all people buy into it. In a large way, we can see the late 19th century and the early 20th century as this power play between those capitalists like Carnegie that understood this world was right and proper and you would have this distribution of wealth, and poor laborers that were like, you know what, this deck is stacked against us. This is not happening. And you have that power play, but it seems like the capitalists hold all the power, right? You can start the factories and you can exponentially acquire wealth and you can influence politics. And you can run for president and you can control the state militia if you know the right people, and you can have personal guards and you can hire detective agencies and you can, I mean, it seems like the wealthy have all of the power. Poor people have one power and one power only, and that is the power of numbers. So I want to talk to you about a couple of moments in the late 19th century when poor people used the power of numbers in order to try to enact change. This is the power of the strike and the power of the boycott. So if you, for instance, on railroads are facing terrible conditions and everything is dangerous on a railroad, you can tell all railroad workers to stop working, and then the railroads effectively shut down. This is what happened in 1877 in a strike of workers against the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It originally happened in Baltimore, but then railroad workers throughout the nation struck in sympathy, and they wouldn't work. Drivers wouldn't work on Pullman trains that carried Pullman cars, or mechanics wouldn't work on on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cars, or the people that operated the switches wouldn't work, or the laborers that made the tracks wouldn't work. So all of these railroad workers striking at once, not just in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, but in multiple railroad industries across the United States. If you think about those as the arteries of the nation, as we talked about in the last class, this cuts off the arteries. This cuts everything off. That is a massive amount of power, but it requires massive mobilization in order to do it. Because this was such a controversial thing, because it caused such havoc, states reacted really differently. Some states were sympathetic and they didn't want to fire on the strikers or the protesters. Other states were not, and they called out the state militias, and those state militias fired into crowds until strikers went back to work. Rutherford B. Hayes, who's president of the United States at the time, decides to send federal troops to put down the strikers. In the end, not a small number of strikers were killed, and this is what ended up stopping the strikes. But think about the consequences of this action. You've got strikers, right? You've got state militias, and then you've got governmental militias, and all of these are against the strikers. This common people thing against the military, that's kind of an American ideal, right? That's something that we talked about in the Revolution, that people talked about in the Civil War. This everybody against the man is a very American thing. People are thinking, this is literal class warfare. I mean, the militia begins to build in Washington, D.C. Poor people start organizing militias of their own. In the midst of all of this, you also have the rise of a very influential labor organization called the Knights of Labor. Now, in its original incarnation, the Knights of Labor did not support striking originally, right? They originally said, well, we really need to work with labor, work with businesses, and work with politicians, and get all of these to agree on basic tenets of survival. But over the course of the 19th century, it became evident that cooperative approach was not happening. And the Knights organized a massive labor protest. In 1886, this great upheaval was supposed to be kind of a coordinated strike that took place across multiple industries. And those multiple industries included the railroads, but they also included factories, and they also included steelworkers, and it was supposed to shut down industry, which it ultimately did. But again, federal troops and state troops shut this down to protect scab workers, to fire into crowds of strikers, and this didn't end up doing as much as the Knights wanted it to do. In 1886, though, shortly after that, there was a little bit of an incident that caused people to panic. This is the Haymarket Affair, or the Haymarket Massacre, or whatever you want to call it. Another national strike was organized, and people were about to participate in it. Citizens were rallying to have a discussion, to talk about this, and to talk about what it meant, and to show support and solidarity for the workers. And in the middle of this civic demonstration, a bomb went off. Nobody knows who did it. Some people say that anarchists did it. Some people say that the government did it. Some people say that the strikers did it. Either way, it ended up causing mass chaos because a bomb went off. Everybody assumed it was everybody else, and fighting broke out. Is this class warfare? None of this was helped by the Panic of 1893, which was the second worst depression so far in America, in which thousands of people were unemployed. You're talking about unemployment rates skyrocketing into the 20s and 30%. You're talking about there are no public welfare assistance. Like there's some bread lines and soup lines and stuff in cities, but you don't have like actual infrastructure for that. There was no guarantee that people were paying their income taxes. That would come as a later reform. So you've got massive suffering, disproportionate suffering to other economic panics. And this led to the rise of the Populist Party, which I'll talk about in a sec. It also led to continued worker agitation. In 1894, there was another massive strike. This one was against the Pullman Company. So the Pullman Company functioned on a kind of paternal capitalism. This kind of paternalism that said, you workers are my children and I will care for you. So Pullman provided housing and medical care. And the idea was that in this welfare capitalism kind of world, Pullman was supposed to provide for his workers what they needed. But in reality, those laws said you will only get paid this much. You have to pay this much rent. You are not permitted to rent anywhere else. You're not permitted to shop for groceries anywhere else. So essentially, it created a monopoly for the workers of the Pullman Company. Pullman decided to cut wages without cutting the costs of living in that monopolistic setup, which enraged his workers. There was a strike that turned into a riot. 30 strikers were killed and 57 were wounded. And in a court case after this, the Supreme Court basically supported the Pullman Company's right to do that. So it became excruciatingly clear that labor and capitalists were on very different sides of the political world. And labor did a fairly decent job competing for political authority because they had the numbers, and that's what democracy is about. But they were consistently and violently put down by companies that had a lot of power. And think about the kind of power that you can have if you're a corporation. You can lobby for specific laws that support you. If you're labor, all that you're doing is screaming into the void, please give us an 8-hour workday. And it's not in anybody's financial interest to do that. So you get a really divided world. These big tycoons of industry who control all of the railways or all of the steel or all of the cloth, like the tycoons that control the major industries in the United States. And then the Populist Party, who's saying, you know what, this is not right. Populism emerged as a political party actually in the West and in the South, which is one of the reasons why it's really exciting, among farmers. And it tried to make an alliance between poor farmers and poor industrial workers in the North and African Americans in the South. And it got some success in that, but not a terrible amount of success. It was probably the most influential third party. The Populists supported William Jennings Bryan in the election of 1896. Bryan ran as a Democrat. It's why Bryan got so much of the South, because he had the populist vote. But the Republicans nominated William McKinley, and McKinley was very much so no regulation of businesses. We're going to support infrastructure. We're going to support companies. We're going to support the tycoons, right? And, you know, I'm not going to go into this too much. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And if you've seen Gangs of New York, this actually fits into this. But one of the reasons why those northern states are so red is because there was a lot of political manipulation of immigrant groups by Republicans who actually functioned against their interests. Now, I want to clarify that while we see in this moment the election between two clear political parties, there's a lot more that's going on. There's the populists that I've already talked about, but there are very much so laissez-faire capitalists that are part of those Republicans. There are also anarchists and Marxists. So these are ideologies that came over from Germany in the mid-19th century. But this idea that capitalism is not the only way that the United States should function, that we should actually work towards a more equitable society where things are controlled by the government and doled out according to need, rather than this kind of cutthroat capitalism that actually causes problems. So you had that, and even more radically than that, you have anarchists that are saying, you know what, we should actually be stateless. It's the government that's the problem. And that embraced a radical kind of equality between white and black and men and women. And these were not idle problems. In 1901, William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, Leo Sotskol, which I'm not going to pronounce, sorry. And this anarchist said that the reason that the reason that he assassinated him was because he was a big business tycoon. He was seen as the symbol of business and laissez-faire, and he's shot by someone that doesn't believe in the government. That is a massive moment, and it would make the rest of the United States really see that stability itself required some mediation of the forces of capitalism. And that would come in the first progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt. So we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt in our next class. That's what I've got for you guys today. I want you to keep thinking about those questions, and I will figure out how to exit this. Haha, there we go. I will apparently go to my committee meeting. We'll talk to you all later.